Okay, so I had a request to do another MOS changes video with regards to the factions, and it was for HARAD, so I will set up HARAD's roster and we'll have a little look at what the changes are. Okay, so what are the differences with HARAD in MOS? Well, I was actually a little surprised that this was one that was specifically requested, because HARAD honestly are one of the factions with the least amount of changes in terms of units anyway that go into MOS. Obviously there are mechanics changes and sort of balance changes which do affect HARAD just like they affect every faction, but with the amount of new units that HARAD have, because the total of new units is only 3, I was surprised that HARAD got requested. Anyway, so we have the Corsairs, obviously a returning unit, the Trollmen are a returning unit, the Hashari are returning, we have the Haradrim Spearmen, another returning unit, and the slightly more elite Southron Warband. Also the Southron Pikemen, which are the Pike variants, we have the Haradrim Archers, the Corsair Archers, the Southron Archers, and the Muhad Tribesmen, in addition to the Serpent Guard. And they have the same roster of cavalry as well. They have the Variag Lancers, they have the Haradrim Raiders, which are of course the Horse Archers. They also have the Serpent Guard. These guys are the very effective shock cavalry that HARAD have. Southron Lancers also make a return. They're slightly less elite, but they're still useful. And the Muhad Beastmasters. Of course, they still also have their Mumakil, which, you know, it's going to be very few and far between the chances you get to use the Mumakil, but when you do, they are, of course, extremely, extremely deadly. So these are the 3 new units, and there's not really an awful lot to say about these guys. There are the Serpent Bodyguards, and these guys are essentially individually more elite versions of the Serpent Guard, but there are fewer in the unit, so it's probably less likely you're going to be using them for anything other than the general, of course. So, you know, potentially a nice little change there. It means you can mass up your Serpent Guard a little bit more, perhaps, but other than that, not a huge difference. We also have a relatively low tier Spearmen in the Variag Tribesmen. They're pretty similar to the Dunland Clansmen in terms of how much quality you get from them. There are quite a lot of them, but again, you know, low tier spears, you know, and that's not something that HARAD were lacking anyway, so the addition of these guys is not particularly important. They do have another archer unit as well, the Variag Archers. Now these guys, they're essentially the same kind of unit as the Haradrim Archers. Now the Haradrim Archers did get a boost in terms of number of men in the unit, as did the Haradrim Spearmen, which, you know, we'll get on to the slight changes in the other units in a minute. But the Variag Archers, there's not really an extremely obvious use for these guys because the Haradrim Archers are pretty much the same unit. They have 2 more, and they kind of, you know, you're more likely to pick the Haradrim Archers than these guys. They do look kind of cool, and it's nice to have a new unit, certainly. But ultimately, I would say that the Serpent Bodyguards, you know, nice to have a General's Bodyguard unit, but the utility of these 3 units is honestly not enormous. So there's not a lot of difference as to how HARAD function as a faction because of these 3 units. Now, of course, I mentioned before that HARAD's low tier units in vanilla were basically useless, because the Haradrim Spearmen were basically a terrible, like, low tier spear unit. And you can get away with that provided there are a lot in the unit, but the Haradrim Spearmen had only 150 in the unit. They have been buffed, so they're basically similar in many respects to like Dunland Clansmen now, which is, you know, what they needed to be in vanilla to be useful. There's no reason you'd not bring the Warband over the Haradrim Spearmen in vanilla. Now, maybe there's a reason. I'd still probably go for the Warband though. The cost in MOS is kind of all over the place with regards to balance, so you may as well go for the more elite units. Similar story with the Haradrim Archers. Again, you may as well go for the Southron Archers. There are a few... Right, the changes with the mechanics in MOS mean that units will last longer in melee. This does mean that the lower tier units are slightly more useful as just sort of covering your retreat. So stuff like the Corsairs and the Southron Warband perhaps have got a little bit stronger. The unit that I think has benefited the most from the changes is probably the Trollman Aparadha, mainly because they still have their 2 hit points. They have a higher defense, they will last longer, and they're also one of the units which has managed to retain some attack score. Generally speaking, the attack score of a lot of these units is kind of low in MOS, but the Trollman Aparadha have got a pretty high attack score. Like, I think, you know, the basic attack score for a lot of spears is like 3. Trollman Aparadha have got an attack score of like 13. So they are potentially pretty useful. They're very similar to Berserkers now, honestly, but Berserkers did get a nerf, so that's worth mentioning. So, yeah, good unit for scaling the walls in MOS, as they always were. A bit more effective all around, really. As for the rest of HARAD, though, I think they have actually suffered as a faction pretty significantly from MOS. in terms of the balance changes, mainly because most factions have got some pretty significant additions to them. Like, you know, when I went through Gondor, they've got a lot of new units, and a lot of them are very strong. It's a similar story with the likes of Arnor and Dwarves as well, Rune especially, Mordor as well. Have got a lot of nice new units in MOS. HARAD really haven't, and that means they have basically, it's like being given a de facto nerf because they've stayed static, whereas pretty much every other faction has moved up in power. The only other factions that I would say have sort of stayed the same, like HARAD, would be the Orcs of the Misty Mountains and Dale. Dale is still a pretty good faction though, because, you know, they always were a pretty good faction because of their archer power. The Orcs of the Misty Mountains suffered pretty horrendously from having no additions. I think the Balrog even got taken away from them. Even though you would never be allowed to use the Balrog, it's still a bit of a shame. But yeah, for HARAD, the problem is they are still very dependent on their Serpent Guard as being their quality in their lines. Their Muhard Tribesmen are a useful unit because, you know, Javelins have been given a bit more of a buff in this mod, but they still suffer a little bit from being outranged. HARAD in MOS have lost a bit of their edge, I think. The good thing about HARAD was always their value for money. And unfortunately, because of the way MOS works, the value for money is kind of all over the place. It's a case of pretty much every faction you can always field most of your best stuff, and you can always mass it up because there's very few units with which you can't use 4 before the cost increases. So, unfortunately, I think HARAD aren't as good as maybe they should be, unless you're allowed to use the Mumakil, of course. Then the whole dynamics shift again because of how strong the Mumakil actually are. But yeah, MOS is a single-player focused submod, and I'm not going to pretend it's anything different. So all this talk of like balance and cost in online play is rather redundant in the main, but nonetheless, you know, it's worth saying that if you're going to play MOS online, then HARAD is probably a faction to avoid, sadly enough, because of the changes that have been given to them. So yeah, I hope that this was somewhat informative. It's not really terribly different from the standard HARAD faction overview. If you wanted to see the HARAD faction overview, it is on my channel somewhere. So if you wanted to see sort of more in-depth explanations about the units that I just sort of skimmed over because it's not really a change for MOS, then you can go and watch that video because it goes into a little bit more detail about what HARAD are good at. And in vanilla, HARAD are significantly better in my opinion. One of my favourite factions to play actually in vanilla, even if they're not technically one of the best. So yeah, I hope to see you for the next video.